The silver dollar was the last thing Owen Ashford left her. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not even a proper goodbye. He'd ridden out on a Tuesday morning in late March, told Clara he was heading to Millhaven to negotiate with the grain supplier, and somewhere between the East Ridge and the river crossing, his horse came back alone. 3 days later, 2 men from town dragged the body out of Kettle Creek and laid it on the porch like a problem they wanted someone else to deal with. The doctor said it was the cold water and a bad fall. Clara didn't argue. She was too tired to argue, and the baby hadn't stopped pressing against her ribs since dawn. That was 4 months ago. Now it was the first week of November, and she was standing in front of the Harwick Orphans station in a coat that didn't button anymore, holding a single silver dollar between her thumb and forefinger, staring at a list of names she hadn't meant to read so carefully. She'd come for supplies. That had been the plan. Drive the wagon into Ridgecross, sell 2 of the hens, collect the dollars she was owed from Pemberton's feed store for returning his fence posts, and buy enough cornmeal and salt pork to get through another 2 weeks. It was a thin plan. It had always been a thin plan. But thin plans were the only kind she had anymore. The orphan station sat between the post office and a collapsed dry goods store that nobody had bothered to tear down yet. It was a low gray building that smelled like boiled wool and wood smoke, and the woman who ran it, Mrs. Tully, a stout widow with ink-stained fingers and a voice like creek water over rocks, had posted a hand-lettered notice in the window. 2 siblings, ages 17 and 10, suitable for farm labor, must be placed together. Clara should have kept walking. She knew that. She was 7 months along with a baby that had no father, a ranch that had no money, and hands that were already cracked down to the bone from doing work that 2 grown men should have been sharing. The last thing she needed was more mouths. She went inside anyway. The boy was sitting on a wooden bench against the far wall, whittling something out of a short piece of pine with a knife that was too nice for a kid in an orphan station. He didn't look up when Clara came in. He was 17, according to the notice, but he had the posture of someone older. Shoulders slightly forward, jaw set, eyes that moved across the room before the rest of his face bothered to react. He wore a shirt that was clean but too small, and his boots had been resoled at least twice. The girl was sitting next to him with a book open on her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was watching the door. She had dark eyes and a gap between her front teeth, and she looked at Clara the way children in orphan stations learn to look at adults, carefully, without much hope, measuring the distance between what people say and what they actually do. "You're the Ashford widow, Mrs. Tully appeared from a back room, wiping her hands on a rag. She wasn't unkind, but she had the manner of a woman who had learned to conduct business quickly because sentiment made things harder. "I heard you might be looking." "I wasn't," Clara said, "but you came in." "I saw the notice." Mrs. Tully looked at her stomach, then at her face, then at the dollar in her hand. "Placement fee is $1 for 2. Usually I ask for references and a property inspection, but you're the Ashford Ranch. I know the land, and frankly, these 2 have been here 6 weeks and the other families keep asking to split them up." She said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd describe a weather pattern. "I won't split them." The boy had stopped whittling. He still hadn't looked up, but his hands were still. "What are their names?" Clara asked. "Dorian Hale, and the girl is Nora." Clara looked at the girl, who was still watching her. "What are you reading?" Nora glanced down at the book like she'd forgotten it was there. "Farm Almanac," she said. "From 1887. It's old." "Most of what I know came from an old almanac." Nora didn't smile, but something shifted in her face. Something small. Clara looked at the boy. "Dorian." He looked up then. His eyes were dark brown and direct, and there was something in them that wasn't hostility exactly, more like a well-practiced readiness for disappointment. "You do ranch work?" she asked. "I've done it." "What kind?" "Fencing, cattle, some carpentry. I'm not bad with horses." He said it without pride, just inventory. "You got a problem taking orders from a woman?" He considered that for a moment. Not performing consideration, actually thinking about it. "Depends on if she knows what she's doing." Clara almost laughed. Almost. "That's fair." She looked down at the dollar in her hand. $1, the last one. The cornmeal and the salt pork and the 2 weeks of breathing room. Gone, just like that, if she put this coin on Mrs. Tully's desk. The ranch had 9 cattle left, 2 of them too old to breed, One of the fences along the north pasture half collapsed, and a root cellar that was light on everything except worry. She was carrying a baby she would have to deliver without Owen, without money, and probably without a doctor if the timing was bad. Every practical part of her brain was telling her to put the dollar back in her pocket and walk out. She put it on the desk. Mrs. Tully picked it up without ceremony and wrote something in her ledger. "I'll need you to sign here. You understand this is a legal guardianship arrangement, not indentured service. These children have rights." "Say, I know what rights are," Clara said quietly. She signed the paper. Her handwriting was not elegant. It never had been, but it was clear. 10. The ride back to the ranch was quiet for the first several miles. Nora sat in the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket, watching the land go by. Dorian sat up on the bench next to Clara with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the road ahead, and neither of them spoke because neither of them had figured out yet what there was to say. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind off the northern ridge had teeth in it. It was Nora who broke the silence, from the back. "Is it far?" "Another hour," Clara said. "Is it a big ranch?" Clara thought about how to answer that. "It was bigger," she finally said. "It'll be bigger again." Nora seemed to accept that. She pulled the blanket tighter and went back to watching the land. Dorian said nothing, but after a few minutes, without being asked, he took the reins from Clara's hands, gently, like he was used to handling things that needed to be handled carefully, and drove the rest of the way himself. Clara let him. Her back had been aching since morning, and the baby was moving again, slow rolling movements that felt like it was running out of room. She pressed her palm flat against her side and breathed and looked at the road ahead and tried not to think too hard about what she'd just done. The first full day was harder than the introduction. Dorian walked the perimeter of the property at first light, before Clara was even up, and by the time she came out to start the morning fire, he was standing at the kitchen door with the look on his face that she recognized because she'd worn it herself. It was the look of someone who has just added up a column of numbers and gotten a sum worse than they expected. "The north fence," he said. "I know. 3 sections are down, completely. The cattle could be anywhere." "They're not anywhere. I checked yesterday. They're in the south pasture. The gate's holding." He looked at her steadily. "For now." "For now," she agreed. He glanced past her into the kitchen, where Nora was already up and setting the table with the careful efficiency of a child who had learned that being useful was the safest way to be. "What's the supply situation?" Clara told him, plainly, without softening it. The cornmeal, the salt, the half-dozen eggs, the cured meat that wouldn't last the week, the money situation, the debt situation, the absence of a situation with the grain supplier because Owen had died before making any arrangement at all. Dorian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "The fence first. I can have the north sections patched in 3 days if you've got wire." "There's wire in the barn. Not enough." "Well, then I'll need to go back to Ridgecross." "We don't have—" "I'm not asking for money. Pemberton's store." "Do you know him?" "Angus Pemberton? Yes. His son works at the Colton Ranch east of here. I fixed a section of their barn roof in September before the station. He owes me." He said it flatly, like it was a simple transaction. "I'll see if Pemberton will extend credit against that." Clara looked at him. 17 years old, sitting at her kitchen table with a plan already in motion that she hadn't thought of. "You negotiate like that often?" Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile. "I've been taking care of Nora since I was 12. You figure things out." She didn't ask what had happened before 12. Not then. Nora turned out to be quietly extraordinary in ways that took a few days to notice. She didn't ask for much. She didn't complain. She found the mending basket without being told and started working through it systematically. And when Clara showed her where the garden had been, she knelt down in the frozen dirt and turned it over with her hands and said, "If we put garlic in before the hard freeze, it'll be first out in spring." She said it like a fact, not a suggestion. "How do you know that?" "The almanac." She brushed the dirt from her palms. "The 1887 one said so. I memorized most of it." "You memorized a farm almanac?" Nora shrugged, slightly self-conscious. There wasn't much else to read at the station. Clara stood there for a moment, looking at this 10-year-old girl who had committed an agricultural almanac to memory in an orphan station because it was something to know, something no one could take away. "We'll put the garlic in today," Clara said. They put the garlic in. Yuck. By the end of the second week, a shape was starting to emerge from the chaos. Dorian had the north fence repaired. Not perfectly, but solidly enough. He'd gotten the wire from Pemberton on credit, done it without ceremony, and come back with 2 extra rolls because he'd talked Pemberton into it by pointing out that a functioning Ashford ranch was better for everyone's business than a collapsed one. Clara didn't know how he'd made that argument, and she hadn't asked, but the wire was there, and the fence was standing. He'd also found what was wrong with the water trough in the east lot, fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been swinging wrong since August, and spent an entire afternoon going through Owen's papers with a patience that Clara hadn't been able to manage herself. He'd laid them out in neat piles at the kitchen table and said, "You want me to explain what I found?" And when she said yes, he'd explained it without softening any of it. The debts were worse than she knew. Owen had borrowed against the cattle twice, once from the bank in Millhaven, once from a private lender named Forsyth, who charged interest rates that sat on the page like a bad joke. There were also 2 unpaid accounts at the grain supplier, and something complicated with a man named Crow, who apparently had a verbal agreement with Owen about timber rights on the north end of the property that had never been put into writing. Verbal agreements, Dorian said, with a 17-year-old's flat contempt for such things. Owen wasn't good with paperwork. He wasn't good with a lot of things, Dorian said, then stopped. Something crossed his face. A tightening, quickly controlled. "I'm sorry, that was—" "No?" Clara said. "You're not wrong." She looked at the papers spread across her table. All of Owen's debts, Owen's half-arrangements, Owen's optimism that had never quite translated into action. She had loved him imperfectly, and he had loved her the same way. And now he was gone, and she was sitting here with a 17-year-old she'd known for 2 weeks who was better at managing the ranch than Owen had ever been. "The Forsyth debt is the worst one," Dorian said. "If he calls it in before spring, we can't cover it." "I know, but he won't want to. If he takes the ranch, he has to run it or sell it, and neither of those is easy. He'd rather have the money." He tapped the paper with one finger. "If we can show him the north fence is repaired and the cattle count is holding, he might extend the terms." "Might?" "It's better than won't." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Nora singing something quietly to herself while she fed the chickens. An old tune, slightly off-key, oddly cheerful for the gray November sky. "Where'd you learn to think like this?" Clara asked. Dorian looked at the papers instead of at her. "When you've got nothing, you learn to think carefully about what you've got." Miss. The discovery happened on a Thursday. Clara hadn't been looking for it. She'd been going through the rest of Owen's papers, the ones in the cedar box under the bed, the ones she'd been avoiding because they felt too much like rummaging through a life that had already closed, and she'd found it tucked inside an old land survey, folded in thirds and soft at the creases from handling. It was a letter. Not to her. Owen had written it 7 years ago to a boy named Dorian Hale, care of a woman named Mrs. Garrett in a town called Pella. The handwriting was Owen's. She knew every tilt and curl of it. But the words were not the Owen she had married. He was apologizing. He'd been 17 himself when it happened. That much was clear from the dates. His mother had died. Their mother, the letter said. Our mother. He'd been left with 2 younger siblings, a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old, and he'd done what a frightened 17-year-old with no money and no plan had done. He'd left them. He'd told himself it was temporary. He'd sent money twice, then stopped, then moved on, then met Clara, then tried to forget. The letter had never been sent. Clara sat on the edge of the bed with the paper in her hands for a long time. The fire in the other room had burned down, and she could hear Dorian moving around in the barn, could hear the particular rhythm of his footsteps that she'd already learned in 2 weeks, the slight hesitation on the left that she'd noticed and not mentioned. She folded the letter back the way she'd found it. She thought about what it would do to Nora, who had built a whole quiet world around not asking about the brother who hadn't come back. She thought about what it would do to Dorian, who had learned to think carefully about what he had, because the alternative was thinking about what he'd lost. And then she thought about what it would do to all three of them. This fragile, strange, unlikely thing they were becoming, if she lit a match to it now. She put the letter back in the cedar box. She didn't burn it. She didn't throw it away. She just put it back under the survey, in the box, under the bed. Because some truths need time before they can be looked at directly. And because the sins of one man, however large, did not have to become the inheritance of the people he left behind. She went back out to the kitchen. Nora was at the table with the almanac open again, making small marks in the margins with a stub of pencil she'd found somewhere. "What are you marking?" Clara asked. "Frost dates," Nora said, without looking up. "For planting next spring." Clara put the kettle on. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, the way it did before snow. She could hear Dorian hammering something in the barn. Slow, deliberate strokes, the sound of someone who didn't rush what needed to be done right. "That's good thinking," Clara said. Nora looked up at her then and smiled, really smiled for the first time, gap-toothed and unguarded and entirely unaware of how much it looked like a man who was no longer alive. Clara smiled back and turned to the fire so Nora wouldn't see her face. The snow came before morning, the first real snow of the year, thick and quiet and serious. And the three of them, pressed together in a house that smelled like wood smoke and kerosene and the remnants of supper, were no longer three strangers sharing a set of difficult circumstances. They were, improbably and without ceremony, beginning to be something else. The snow that came before morning didn't leave. It settled in like a difficult house guest, politely at first, just a few inches that made the ranch look almost peaceful in the gray early light, then more insistently as the days passed, piling against the north fence, filling the ruts in the road to Ridgecross, turning the water trough to solid ice twice a week in a way that required a good 10 minutes of work with a hammer before the cattle could drink. December arrived without announcement and without mercy. Dorian was up before Clara every morning. She didn't ask him to be, and she didn't thank him for it because she had the sense that thanking him would embarrass him, and because the work needed doing regardless of who was doing it, and sentiment didn't factor into frozen water troughs. He'd be out in the dark with the lantern while she started the fire, and by the time Nora was up and breakfast was on, he'd have already done the things that most needed doing before the cold got worse. He was not easy to know. That much was clear. He answered direct questions directly, and he didn't volunteer information about himself. And there were moments, usually in the evenings, when the work was done and there was nothing left to fill the silence, when he'd go very still and look at something that wasn't in the room, and Clara had learned not to intrude on those moments because whatever he was looking at, it wasn't something she could help him see differently. But he was reliable in the way that mattered most on a failing ranch in winter. He showed up. Every morning, without drama, without negotiation, in weather that would have made a grown man reconsider his life choices. He showed up, and he worked, and when something didn't work the first way, he tried another way, and when he didn't know how to do something, he said so plainly and figured it out. The old trough fittings cracked, he told her one morning in the second week of December, standing in the kitchen doorway with cold coming off him like weather. "I can wrap it, but it'll fail again. We need a new fitting from the hardware in Millhaven." "Millhaven's a day-and-a-half ride." "I know that." Clara looked at him. "What's it cost?" 80 cents? Maybe $1 with the fitting size we need." She didn't have 80 cents. Not with the Forsyth payment due in February and the grain account still open. She had $11 and some change in the coffee tin, and every one of those dollars was already spoken for 3 times over. "Let me think on it," she said. "There's another option," he said. "There's a rancher east of here, Matson. He's got a fitting that size in his barn. I saw it when I passed his property in October. He might trade for labor." "You'd go work for Matson?" "A day's work, maybe 2. It's faster than riding to Millhaven and cheaper than buying new." He said it like it was obvious, because to him, it was. He had a mind that moved naturally toward barter, toward leverage, toward finding the third option when the first 2 were both bad. Claire had started to think it was the most useful thing about him. "Talk to Matson," she said. He was back in 2 days with the fitting and a sore shoulder from splitting wood, and he fixed the trough that same afternoon without any particular expression on his face about it. That was how December went. Problem by problem, solution by solution, none of them elegant, most of them just barely enough. Nora's garlic was under the frozen ground waiting for spring, which felt optimistic in a way that Clara found she needed. The girl had taken over the kitchen with a quiet authority that nobody had granted her, and nobody questioned. She knew which herbs were in which jar. She remembered what was running low before Clara noticed, and she had a particular talent for making thin food taste like more than it was. The cornmeal porridge she made was not exciting, but it was warm and it was filling, and she'd figured out that adding the dried sage from the garden made it taste less like desperation. "Where'd you learn to cook?" Clara asked her one evening, watching her stir. Nora shrugged one shoulder. "The station. Mrs. Tully let me help sometimes. And before that," she didn't elaborate on before that. "You're good at it. Dorian says I oversalt things. Dorian eats everything like he's afraid it'll be taken away. His opinion on flavor doesn't count." Nora looked up at that, surprised, and then laughed. A short, real sound that she seemed slightly startled by herself. It happened like that with her. Laughter arrived unexpected and left quickly, like it wasn't sure it was allowed to stay. They were sitting at the table after supper on a Tuesday in mid-December when Dorian came in from the barn with a different look on his face than usual. Not troubled exactly, but focused in a particular way, the way he got when he'd been working something over in his head for a while. He sat down, pulled the coffee tin toward him, not to take money, just to have something to look at, and said, "I've been thinking about the cattle." Clara waited. "We've got 9 head, 2 too old to breed, which means 7 productive animals. The spring calving, if we're lucky, gives us maybe 4 or 5 new calves, which is not enough to change the numbers significantly by fall." He was looking at the tin, not at her. "But Matson's got a bull he's not using. He mentioned it while I was there. His breeding program's going a different direction. He might sell cheap or loan him out for a season. A loan arrangement. If we can calve 12, 13 animals this spring instead of 5, the fall numbers look completely different." He finally looked up. "I think I can get him to agree to a loan. We give him first pick of 2 calves in the fall." Clara considered this. It was a real idea. Not a guaranteed idea, not a safe idea, but a real one. And if the calves don't come out the quality he wants, then we negotiate. But that's a fall problem. Right now the problem is spring. She looked at him for a moment. 17 years old, sitting at her kitchen table in a shirt that still didn't quite fit him right, laying out livestock strategy with the calm of someone twice his age. "Set up the meeting," she said. He nodded once. "I'll ride out Thursday." But the meeting with Matson didn't go easily. Dorian came back on Thursday evening with mud on his boots and a look that said he'd worked harder for the thing than he'd expected to. "He'll do it," he said, before Clara could ask. "But he wants 3 calves, not 2, and he wants to specify breeding preference." "That's steep." "I got him down from 4. He sat down heavily. "And I told him we'd put it in writing." "In writing," Clara repeated with some satisfaction. Owen's ghost flickered at the edge of the conversation. Invisible, unmentioned. "Writing," Dorian confirmed. "I'm not doing verbal agreements." Clara went to get paper. They drafted it that night, the 3 of them at the kitchen table. Dorian laying out the terms, Clara revising the language, Nora pointing out twice that they'd forgotten to specify the date range in a way that would matter in court, which caused both of them to look at her with an expression she clearly found excessive. "I read the almanac," she said with dignity. "It had legal examples in the back." They finished the document around 9 o'clock. The fire had burned down and it was cold enough to see their breath slightly, and Nora had fallen asleep sitting up with her head on her folded arms, and Dorian was reading over the final version with his finger moving under each word slowly, the way he read when he wanted to be sure. "It's good," he said finally. "You sound surprised. I've seen people get robbed by contracts before." "So have I," Claire said. "That's why I read them." He put the paper down. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the fire popped once and settled, and Nora's breathing was slow and even across the table. "The Forsyth debt," Dorian said. "February." "I know. I've been trying to think of how we cover it." He rubbed the back of his neck. "We can't, not in full. Not with what we have." "I know that too. But if we go to Forsyth before he comes to us, if we bring the agreement with Matson, show him the fence repairs, show him the cattle count, he might renegotiate the terms instead of calling it in." Claire had thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since the Thursday she'd laid out Owen's debts on the kitchen table and watched Dorian sort them into piles. He's not a generous man. He doesn't have to be generous. He just has to do the math. Dorian's voice was flat and precise. A ranch that collapses in February is worth less to him than a ranch that pays him interest through the year and settles in full in the fall. He's a lender, not a farmer. He doesn't want the land. You sound very sure of that for someone who's never met him. I'm not sure, but I'd rather go in with an argument than wait for him to show up with a notice. Clara looked at him for a long moment, at this boy who had spent years with nothing learning to think, like someone who couldn't afford to get things wrong. All right, she said. We'll ride to Millhaven next week. Millhaven in December was cold and commercial and indifferent to other people's problems, which made it a good place to do business. Forsyth kept his office above the hardware store, a practical arrangement that said something about the man. He liked to be near the tools of transactions. He was 60, thick through the shoulders, with small eyes that did the work of assessing you before his face bothered to register any expression at all. He looked at Clara's stomach when they walked in. Then he looked at Dorian, who was standing slightly behind and to her right, in a way that was not quite deferential but was clearly deliberate, present, not leading, letting Clara do what needed to be done. Mrs. Ashford, Forsyth said, I expected I'd be hearing from you. You're hearing from me now, Clara said. She sat down without being invited to. Her back hurt, and she wasn't going to stand through a negotiation she needed to win. I want to discuss the February payment. I imagine you do. She put the papers on his desk. The Matson agreement, the cattle count, Dorian's written assessment of the fence repairs with measurements and materials logged, and a projection for fall income that they'd worked out together over 2 evenings with a piece of charcoal and a board. It was not a polished document. It was a working document, which was different and sometimes better. Forsyth looked through it slowly. He didn't say anything for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. The boy did these numbers? He finally said, looking at Dorian. We both did, Clara said. The handwriting's different. I'm better at projections. He's better at inventory. Forsyth looked at the paper again. Clara could see him running the math the way Dorian said he would. Not generously, but practically. The arithmetic of a collapsed ranch versus a functioning one, laid out in numbers instead of sentiment. I'll extend to September, he said at last. Full balance plus accrued interest. Not $1 less. August, Clara said. Forsyth looked at her. The fall market prices peak in late August, not September. If you want full payment, you want August. A pause. Something moved in his small eyes that might have been respect or might have just been recalculation. August, he agreed. Terms in writing. We brought paper, Dorian said quietly from behind her. They didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. They'd bought time, not safety, and everyone in the wagon knew the difference. On the ride back, Dorian was quiet for the first 20 miles, and then he said, without preamble, You did well in there. You prepared me well, Clara said. You would have done it without me. Maybe, but not as well. She kept her eyes on the road. You know that's true, same as I do. He didn't answer. The horse's breath made clouds in the cold air. After a while, Nora, who had come along because leaving her alone at the ranch for a full day felt wrong, even though she'd told them firmly that she was 10 and not an infant, said from the back of the wagon, Is the ranch going to be okay? Dorian started to answer, but Clara spoke first. We're going to make it okay. That's not the same as yes, Nora said. No, Clara agreed. It's not. Nora seemed to think about this. Okay, she said, and went back to looking at the road. Date. January arrived with a cold that was different in quality from December. Less fresh, more settled, the kind of cold that had decided to stay and wasn't apologizing about it. The cattle needed more feed than expected. The barn roof over the east stall developed a slow leak that dripped ice at night and water in the afternoon. And Dorian spent 3 days in January on that roof in temperatures that were genuinely dangerous, and came down each evening with his hands white and his movements stiff, and ate supper without complaint, and went to bed and got up and did it again. Clara watched him do this and found herself thinking about what it cost a person to become that reliable. It didn't come from nothing. That kind of steadiness in a 17-year-old was not a natural accident. It was built from something difficult, from years of deciding that falling apart was a luxury you couldn't afford. She had not gone back to the cedar box. She hadn't forgotten the letter, but she'd made her decision and she was keeping it. What she hadn't expected was that the truth might find its own way. It happened on a Friday evening in the third week of January. Clara had gone to bed early because the baby had been restless all day, and her body was demanding rest in the insistent way it had developed recently, impossible to negotiate with. She was half asleep when she heard voices in the kitchen, low, not arguing, just talking. And something in the quality of the sound made her stay still and quiet. Dorian said, "You remember the house in Pella?" A pause, then Nora. "A little. The window had a crack in it." "Yeah." Silence. The fire settling. "Do you think about him?" Nora asked. She said him the way children say words that have too much weight, carefully, like it might break if they press too hard. A long pause. "Sometimes." "I don't," Nora said. "Not really. I tried to stop." "That's probably smart. Do you hate him?" Dorian was quiet for long enough that Clara thought he might not answer. Then, "I don't know. I used to. Now I don't think about it that much." "Because of here?" Another pause. "Yeah, maybe." Nora said, Clara's not like what I thought she'd be." "What did you think she'd be?" "I don't know. Different. More like a grown-up." Dorian made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "She is a grown-up. She doesn't act like the grown-ups at the station. She doesn't talk to us like we're problems." A long quiet. Clara lay completely still. "No," Dorian said finally. "She doesn't." "Do you think it's real? Like, do you think it stays?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower. "I think she spent her last dollar on us. Yeah, I think it's real." Nora said, "Okay," in a small, careful voice. And then there was the sound of her getting up and going to her room, and the soft sound of a door. Clara lay in the dark with the baby moving slow and steady under her hand, and didn't move for a long time. She had not chosen to love these two children. She wasn't sure love was the right word yet, for something this new, and this strange, and this much work. But she had chosen to spend her last dollar. She had chosen to put a letter back in a cedar box. She had chosen to sit at a kitchen table until 9 o'clock drafting agreements, and to ride to Millhaven, and to let a boy take her reins when her back hurt, and to ask a girl what she was reading and mean it. She hadn't chosen any of it for noble reasons. She'd chosen it because the ranch needed hands, and because something in Dorian's direct gaze and Nora's careful watch had looked like something she recognized, something that understood what it was to be in a situation you hadn't asked for, and to deal with it as best you could anyway. But somewhere in the machinery of that practical choice, something else had happened. Something that didn't have a clean name and didn't need one. Outside, the wind moved across the north ridge, and the cattle were in the south pasture where the gate was holding, and the garlic was under the frozen ground waiting for spring. And a boy with a sore shoulder and too much steadiness for his age was banking the fire in the kitchen before he went to bed. The Ashford Ranch was still in debt. The February, now August, note with Forsyth was still outstanding. The trough fitting was holding for now, but would need replacing again before summer. The roof over the east stall was patched but not fixed, and there would be more problems. There were always more problems, and none of them were going to stop arriving just because the people inside the house had started to feel, cautiously and impermanently, like something worth protecting. But the fire was banked, and the gate was holding, and the garlic was in the ground, and for now, tonight, that was enough. The garlic came up in March. Nora found it on a Tuesday morning, 6 small green shoots pushing through the thawed edge of the garden bed, and she stood there in her coat with her boots still muddy from the path and stared at them for long enough that Dorian came to see what she was looking at. "Told you," she said. "You did," he agreed. She didn't say anything else about it, but she came back twice more that day to check, and by evening she'd marked the spot with a short stake so no one would step on them by accident, and that was Nora. She didn't make announcements about the things she cared about, she just quietly protected them. March was easier than February, which had been easier than January, and none of them said that out loud because Frontier Winters had a way of hearing that kind of thing and taking it personally. The Matson bull had been installed in the south pasture since mid-February, and the first signs of the spring calving were starting to show in the older cows. Dorian checked them every morning with the focused attention of someone who understood that each calf represented a specific number on a specific document in a specific cedar box, and that the numbers needed to work. Clara was moving slower now. The baby was due in early April. The doctor in Ridgecross had said first week, maybe second, and her body had reached the stage of pregnancy where it made its demands non-negotiable. She still did the books every evening. She still drove the wagon into Ridgecross when it needed to be driven. But she'd given up pretending she could split wood or haul water, and she'd given up apologizing about it. And Dorian had stopped pretending not to notice and just did those things without comment. There was a man named Crow who started coming around in March. He'd been a peripheral problem since November, Owen's verbal agreement about the timber rights on the north end of the property, the one that had never been put to paper. Clara had hoped that without documentation, Crow would simply let it dissolve. She'd been wrong about that. He came the first time on a Wednesday, driving a good wagon with two men she didn't recognize sitting in the back. He was maybe 50, heavy-set, with a way of smiling that used his mouth but not his eyes. He said he'd heard things were stabilizing at the Ashford Ranch, and he wanted to discuss the timber arrangement he'd had with Owen. Clara told him there was no arrangement she could find evidence of. Crow said Owen had given his word, and his word was as good as paper. Clara said she was sure that was true, but words didn't survive their speakers in a court of law, and she'd need documentation before she could honor anything. Crow's smile stayed on his face the whole time, which was more unsettling than if he'd gotten angry. He said he'd be back, and he left. Dorian had been in the barn during the conversation, but he'd heard it. The barn door was slightly open, and the voices carried. When Crow's wagon was down the road, he came out and stood next to Clara and watched the dust. "What does he want?" Dorian asked. "The timber on the North Ridge, 40 acres of it probably. Good hardwood, worth real money." "And Owen actually agreed to sell it to him?" "I don't know. Owen agreed to a lot of things he didn't write down." She kept her eyes on the road. "But even if he did, an oral agreement with a dead man isn't enforceable." "Crow seems to think it is." "Crow seems to think a lot of things." She turned back toward the house. "He'll be back. When he comes back, I want you here." "I was planning on it." Crow came back twice more in March. The second time he brought a man who introduced himself as a legal advisor, which Clara took to mean someone who'd read enough law to know which words sounded official without necessarily knowing what they meant. She listened, asked questions that the legal advisor found inconvenient to answer, and told them both she would be in touch. The third time Crow came alone later in the day, when the light was going and the shadows were long, and he didn't bother with the legal advisor's language. He said the timber was worth more than the debt she owed Forsyth, and he could make the Forsyth problem go away if she wanted to be reasonable. She stood on the porch with her hands at her sides and said she'd think about it. She didn't think about it. She wrote a letter to a lawyer in Millhaven named Aldous Pratt that same night, describing the situation in detail. Dorian helped her with the language. "You've read legal documents," she said, watching him revise a sentence. "I told you. You figure things out." He crossed something out and rewrote it. "There was a man at the station once, when Nora was small. He tried to get her separated from me through a paperwork arrangement. I figured out what he was trying to do by the time the second form arrived." Clara looked at him. "What happened?" "Mrs. Tully wouldn't sign it, but I wanted to understand what I was looking at so it couldn't happen again." He handed the paper back. "That's better." She sent the letter to Pratt the next morning. The response came back in 8 days, which was fast for Millhaven. Pratt's opinion was clear. Without written documentation, Crow had no enforceable claim. He also noted, in the careful language of a man who had seen this before, that Crow's approach, arriving with companions, referencing debts, suggesting trades, had certain characteristics worth documenting carefully. Clara read the letter twice. Then she got out a fresh piece of paper and started keeping a record. Every visit, every word she could remember, dated and signed. Dorian added his own observations separately on a second sheet. Nora, who had been present for Crow's first visit, contributed 3 sentences in her careful child's handwriting, which were, Clara noted, more precisely worded than most adult testimony she'd ever read. Crow didn't know he was being documented. That was fine. April arrived the way it always did on the northern frontier. Not gently, but grudgingly, winter loosening its grip the way a fist unclenches when it's exhausted rather than willing. The days got longer. The mud got worse. 2 calves arrived in the first week, both healthy, a better start than Clara had dared to project. Dorian sat up 3 nights in a row during the calving and came into breakfast each of those mornings looking like someone had scooped out the inside of him and he was running on the shell. But the calves were alive and standing, and he reported this each morning with the brevity of a man who'd learned not to attach too much to good news in case it reversed. The baby was due in the first week of April. Then the second week came, and the baby was apparently taking its time. "Babies come when they come," Clara said, when Dorian asked if she'd heard from the doctor. "You should have him on call. He's in Ridgecross. He can't stand by indefinitely. I can ride to get him when—" "Dorian," she looked at him. "I've read the manual. I know what to watch for. It won't be a surprise." He didn't look satisfied with this, but he let it go because he'd learned, slowly, with some friction, that there were certain decisions Clara made from a position of knowledge and certain ones she made from a position of stubbornness, and it wasn't always possible to tell from the outside which was which, and arguing against the knowledge one's made you look foolish. What nobody had read in any manual was the weather that came down from the northern range on the 15th of April. It started as clouds. That was all. Clouds that piled up on the northern horizon through the afternoon, heavy and low and a particular shade of gray that experienced people in that part of the country recognized. Dorian saw them first, from the barn roof where he'd been resecuring the patched section, and he came down the ladder faster than he usually moved and went to find Clara. "That's not a regular storm," he said. She was at the kitchen table with the account books, and she looked up and looked out the window and looked at him. "No," she said, "it's not." They spent the next 3 hours moving with controlled urgency. Dorian got the cattle into the barn, all of them, including the 2 old ones and the new calves, which required an extended argument with one of the older cows that had opinions about the matter. Clara and Nora brought in every piece of equipment that could be damaged, every tool that was loose, every piece of stored feed that was outside. They brought extra wood into the house. They filled every container they had with water from the well, because once a storm like this took hold, the pump would freeze. "How long?" Nora asked, carrying an armload of split wood. "Could be a day," Dorian said. "Could be 3. Nora processed this with the pragmatic calm of a child who had lived in an orphan station through 2 frontier winters and understood that catastrophe was mostly a logistical problem. "We have enough food for 5 days, she said, "if we're careful." "We'll be careful," Clara said. The wind picked up at dusk. By full dark, the snow was coming sideways, and by midnight, it was the kind of storm that didn't need to announce itself because the sound of it was announcement enough. A deep, sustained howl that wasn't dramatic so much as simply enormous, the way true force is, without personality or intention, just pressure and cold and the end of navigation. Clara woke at 2 in the morning with a pain that was different from the others. She lay still for a moment, measuring it. Then it came again, longer this time, lower, and she sat up in the dark and understood with complete clarity that the baby had decided that tonight, of all nights, was the night. She sat on the edge of the bed for a minute, just breathing. Outside, the storm was doing what it was doing, indifferent and enormous. The temperature in the house had dropped despite the fire. She could feel it against her face. She got up. She lit the lamp. She went to Dorian's door and knocked. He was awake before she finished knocking. She suspected he'd barely slept, listening to the storm. He opened the door in his clothes, which meant he'd gone to bed in them, which meant he'd been expecting something might need him tonight. "It's time," she said. He looked at her face, then at the lamp, then at the window where the storm was visible as a wall of moving white even in the dark. Something moved through his expression. Not panic, but a rapid internal reckoning, the kind she'd watched him do when the fence was down or the numbers were bad, the mind running ahead of the face. "The doctor can't get here," he said. Not a question. "No road's passable. Not in this." "Okay." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration. "Tell me what to do." Nora appeared in her doorway, hair loose, eyes wide and alert. She looked at Clara's face and didn't ask. "I'll build the fire up," she said, and went to do it. That was the thing about these 2. They didn't perform in emergencies. They just moved. Clara's medical guide was in the cedar box. Not the same one as the letter. A different compartment. A slim book she'd bought in Mill Haven, before the wedding when she was still optimistic about doctors being available. She got it out and gave it to Dorian, open to the relevant pages. "Read this," she said. "All of it. You have time. The early labor is slow." He sat at the kitchen table under the lamp and read it. She watched his face move through the information, careful, serious, a slight tightening around his eyes when he reached the complications section. "Most of this is for normal delivery," he said. "Most deliveries are normal. But if it's not, then we deal with that when we know." She put her hand on the table, not quite reaching his. "Dorian, look at me." He looked up. "I've been in difficult situations. You've been in difficult situations. We've been getting through things since November. This is harder than what we've faced, but it's not different in kind." She paused, and she didn't let herself think about Owen, about the doctor who wasn't coming, about the storm that had 30 miles of road under it. "I need you to be steady, that's all. Just steady." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I can do that. I know you can." Nora had the fire built up to a real heat, and had put water on without being asked. She'd read that section of the book over Dorian's shoulder, apparently, or she'd simply reasoned it out, because Nora's reasoning was frequently better than people expected. She'd also made up the bed in the main room closer to the fire with the extra quilts, which was a better arrangement than the back bedroom. Clara hadn't asked for that either. "I thought it would be warmer," Nora said, when Clara looked at the bed. "It is warmer. This is right." The early labor stretched across the hours with the particular slow cruelty of things that demand patience from people who have no patience to spare. The storm screamed outside. The fire held. Nora fed it with the steady attention of someone who had been given one job and intended to do it perfectly, adding wood in the careful increments that kept the heat even rather than volatile. Dorian stayed close. He didn't hover, because hovering would have driven Clara insane, but he stayed in the room, within range of her voice, doing small things, keeping the kettle warm, moving a chair, holding the lamp at better angles when she needed to see something. Twice he asked if the pain was what the book described, and she said yes both times. And both times he went back to the book and read more of it methodically, like he was studying for something he couldn't afford to fail. "You're going to be a doctor after this," Clara said, during a break between contractions, trying to find lightness somewhere. "I'm going to burn that book after this," he said without looking up. She almost laughed. Almost. The storm peaked somewhere around 4 in the morning. They could feel it in the way the walls seemed to press inward, the temperature dropping another degree despite the fire, the sound shifting from a howl to something deeper and more serious. A section of the roof over the back room made a sound that said it was under real pressure, and Dorian went back there with the lamp and came back saying it was holding, but only just. "If it goes," he started. "It won't," Clara said, and she said it with a certainty she didn't entirely feel, because she had learned that sometimes you had to speak things into being, had to say the words that needed to be true until they were. By 5 in the morning, things were moving faster. Clara was not afraid. She was in too much pain to be afraid, which she'd later think was something of a mercy. The pain was a specific and consuming thing that pushed everything else out. The storm, the debt, the letter in the cedar box, Crow and his timber rights, all of it, and left only the immediate and the necessary. This was the body's brutality and also, somehow, its gift. There was nothing else. Just this. Dorian followed the guide. He followed it line by line, asking questions when he needed to, and Clara answered in between contractions with the brisk accuracy of a woman who had read the same pages. Nora kept the fire. The water stayed warm. The lamp held. The baby came at 10 minutes past 6 in the morning, with the storm still raging outside, into Dorian's hands. And then nothing. No sound. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Clara counted them, each one a different kind of terror than anything she'd experienced on the worst days of the past 4 months. Worse than the debt. Worse than the fence. Worse than standing in the cemetery in the cold April of last year, watching Owen's box go into the ground. 4 seconds. Then the baby cried. It was a thin, indignant, remarkably loud sound for something so small, and it broke open the silence of the room like a stone through glass, and Dorian made a sound that Clara had never heard from him before. A short, ragged exhale, like a man surfacing from water, and Nora, who had been holding so perfectly still at the fire that she might have been carved from the same wood she was burning, sat down on the floor very suddenly with her hands over her face. Clara said, "Is she—" and her voice came out wrong, thick and unsteady. Dorian said. He was wrapping the baby in the cloth they'd prepared, hands that had been shaking slightly for the last 2 hours now, somehow completely still. "It's a boy." He handed him over, and Clara held her son for the first time with the storm still howling outside and the fire burning bright behind Nora's back. And the baby's face was red and furious and absolutely perfect in the way that entirely imperfect things sometimes are. She didn't have a name settled. She'd been thinking about it for months and had 3 possibilities and hadn't committed to any of them, because committing to a name felt like tempting something. But looking at this face now, with these 2 people in this room, on this particular terrible and extraordinary morning, she said the name she didn't know she'd already decided. "Owen," she said. And then, because it needed a second name, a name for what he'd come through and who had brought him through it, Owen Dorian Ashford. Dorian went very still. Clara looked at him, holding the baby against her chest. He was 17 years old, and he had just delivered a baby in a blizzard by lamplight from a book he'd read 3 hours earlier. And he was standing in the middle of a kitchen that wasn't his, in a ranch that hadn't been his 6 months ago, with his hands that still had traces of what birth looked like. And his face was doing something she'd never seen it do. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why it means something." Nora got up off the floor and came to look at the baby with enormous, red-rimmed eyes, and she looked at him for a long time without speaking. "He's very small," she said. "He came early," Clara said. "He'll catch up. He sounds loud for how small he is. He has opinions, I can tell already." Nora reached out one finger, very carefully, and touched the baby's hand, and the baby, with the magnificent indifference of the newborn, grabbed it with a grip that was absurd for its size and held on. Nora's face did something complicated and private, and then she sat down on the edge of the bed and didn't let go, and the baby kept holding her finger, and outside the storm was beginning, just barely, just at its very edges, to ease. Dorian cleaned up with the methodical quiet of someone processing something too large to speak about. He put water on for Clara, put the book away, checked the fire, checked the baby, checked the roof again over the back room. He moved through the room with the same steadiness she'd asked of him in the dark at 2 a.m, before all of it, and he was keeping it now even when he didn't have to, even when there was nothing left that required it. Clara watched him from the bed with the baby against her chest, and Nora's hand tangled up with the baby's, and she thought about a silver dollar, and a wooden bench in a gray building, and a boy with a knife who hadn't looked up. She'd spent that dollar on an impossible bet. She was looking at what it had bought. By midday, the storm had dropped to a manageable snow, still heavy, but no longer the kind that erased the world. The cattle in the barn were alive, all of them, including the new calves. The fire in the house was holding at a real warmth. The roof over the back room had held through the worst of it, with only a thin leak along one seam that Dorian said he could fix in an hour once the snow stopped. The baby slept with the particular authority of someone who had arrived after great effort and intended to rest about it. Nora fell asleep in the chair by the fire, with her book on her lap, and her mouth slightly open, and Clara didn't wake her. Dorian sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he was looking at the table, and Clara said his name softly. He looked over. "Thank you," she said. He looked back at the table. "You did most of it." "Dorian." He looked up again. "Thank you," she said again, and meant it the way that word only means something when it's carrying more than the word itself can hold. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow was softening, and the light through the window was the particular quality of winter afternoon when the worst has passed and the world is very white and very still, and you can hear things again. "Yeah," he said, and then quietly, looking back at the table, "You're welcome." The roof over the back room took Dorian 4 days to fix properly, not 1 hour, because when he got up there after the snow stopped and pulled back the damaged section, he found the problem was older and deeper than the blizzard had caused. The underlying boards had been going soft for 2 seasons, and the storm had simply finished what time had started. He told Clara this without editorializing, just the facts, and she said, "Fix it right, not fast." And he did. May arrived while he was still on that roof some days, and the light changed the way it does in spring on the high frontier, sharper and cleaner, with a quality that made everything look more itself than it had under the gray weight of winter. The calves were growing. The garlic was up fully now, 12 strong plants in Nora's garden bed, and she'd added onion starts along the south edge and was eyeing the space next to the barn for something she hadn't announced yet. Owen Dorian Ashford was small but loud and gaining weight, according to the measurements Clara kept in a notebook with the same systematic attention she gave the cattle. He'd been 6 weeks early, and the first 2 weeks had been frightening in ways that Clara had managed by simply not allowing herself to look too far forward, just the next feeding, the next hour, the next morning. But he'd held, and then he'd steadied, and by the end of April he was doing things that early babies weren't always able to do, and by the time the roof was fixed he was doing them with a certain insistence that suggested his opinions about the world were already formed, and he intended to express them continuously. Nora was devoted to him in the wordless way she was devoted to things she cared about, not talking about it, just present, just there. She'd learned to hold him correctly in the first week, and she'd learned his sounds by the second, and by the third she could tell Clara from the other room whether the crying was hunger or discomfort or simply the expression of sentiment that all babies seem to require several times a day. Dorian held the baby less often, but more carefully, like he was aware of the weight of what he was holding in a way that went past the physical. When Owen grabbed his finger the way he'd grabbed Nora's on the first morning, Dorian looked at the ceiling for a moment with an expression Clara decided not to examine too closely. Life settled into something that was not peace exactly. The ranch was still a place where something needed doing every hour of every day, but it had a shape to it now, a rhythm that the three of them had worked out together over the winter without ever discussing it. They knew each other's mornings. They knew each other's silences. They knew which problems to bring to Clara and which ones Dorian had already handled, and which ones Nora had quietly prevented from becoming problems by addressing them before anyone noticed. It was into this settled, fragile, hard-won rhythm that Crow returned in May, and this time he didn't come alone and he didn't come politely. He brought a man named Gessler, who was not a legal advisor but an actual lawyer, and he brought 2 signed statements from men in Ridgecross who claimed to have been present when Owen Ashford verbally agreed to the timber arrangement. Clara didn't recognize either name. Dorian, when she showed him the statements that evening, read them carefully and said the phrasing in both was nearly identical, word for word in 3 places. "People don't remember conversations the same way," he said. "Not word for word like that." "I know." These were written by the same person and signed by 2 different names. "I know that too." She took the papers back. "Gessler's the one I'm worried about. He's an actual lawyer. He knows how to make something that isn't real look official enough that you have to respond to it formally." "What does Pratt say?" She'd already written to Pratt. The response came back in 6 days. Pratt said the statements were problematic in the way that carefully constructed fraudulent documents were problematic. Not obviously false, but deeply suspect, and the kind of thing that became dangerous not in court, where they probably wouldn't survive scrutiny, but in the period before court, where they could create enough uncertainty to pressure a settlement. He also said, in language that was only slightly diplomatic, that Crow was known in Millhaven circles as a man who specialized in acquiring distressed properties through exactly this kind of sustained pressure. Clara read the letter twice and thought about what it meant to fight something like this without money for a prolonged legal battle. Then she thought about the documentation she and Dorian had been keeping since March. Every visit, every date, every word. The 2 signed statements from Ridgecross she now had copies of, and Dorian had noted the identical phrasing in writing the same evening he'd noticed it. She wrote back to Pratt and asked what it would cost to have him look at everything they had. The answer was more than she wanted to spend and less than she'd feared. She said yes. Pratt came to the ranch in the 2nd week of May, which was unusual. Lawyers didn't typically make ranch calls, but he said he wanted to see the property, and he also said, in a way that suggested he found Crow professionally irritating, that he had an interest in looking at the documentation in full. He was a lean, quiet man in his 60s who looked at everything with careful, slightly tired eyes and asked questions that were better than the questions she'd expected. He spent an hour with Clara's records. Then he asked to speak with Dorian. Dorian sat across the kitchen table from Aldous Pratt with the same posture he brought to everything. Back straight, eyes direct, no performance. Pratt asked him about the visits, about Crow's manner, about specific statements Crow had made. Dorian answered each question with the precise, undramatic accuracy of someone who had learned that clarity was more useful than emphasis. Toward the end, Pratt said, "How old are you?" 18 in July. Pratt looked at him for a moment. "You wrote these observations yourself? No assistance?" Clara reviewed them after, for anything I'd missed. "The language is mine." Pratt nodded slowly and looked back at the papers. "The identical phrasing in the Ridgecross statements. Did you note that the same night you read them?" "Same night. I wrote the date at the top." "Good." Pratt gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I want to send copies of all of this to Crow's lawyer directly, along with a letter that makes clear we are aware of the nature of the statements and their provenance." He looked at Clara. "This won't end the dispute immediately, but it will change the character of it considerably." "Meaning?" Clara said. "Meaning that a man who intended to pressure you into a settlement now knows you have documentation that could embarrass him professionally. That changes the math." Clara thought about Dorian saying he's a lender, not a farmer. He wants the money, not the land. Different situation, same principle. Everyone was doing math. The question was whether yours was better than theirs. "Send the letter," she said. Crow's response came not through Gessler but directly, and it was not a legal document. It was a note, handwritten, delivered by one of his men, that said he was willing to discuss a revised arrangement regarding the timber rights at her convenience. Clara read it, put it in the cedar box, and wrote back that she didn't see any basis for an arrangement of any kind given the absence of documentation from the original party, and that any further contact should go through her attorney. She signed it without flourish. Dorian read her response before she sent it. He handed it back without changes. "Good," he said. She hadn't asked for his approval, but it landed the way it did. The one syllable from someone who didn't spend words carelessly. Crow didn't come back. That was May. June brought its own set of problems, because the ranch was not finished having problems, and anyone who thought surviving a blizzard and a legal threat meant they were done being tested by the Frontier had badly misread the Frontier. The east pasture fence that Dorian had repaired in the fall had held through the winter but was showing weakness along a 40-foot stretch that needed to be replaced, not patched. One of the older cows, the better of the two he'd considered too old to breed, developed a condition that the almanac described and that Clara recognized, and they treated it for 2 weeks without certainty of outcome before the animal turned the corner. The grain account was manageable now, but not comfortable. Clara had sold 2 of the calves earlier than planned, not the ones promised to Matson, but 2 additional from a fortunate second round of calving that had given them more animals than projected. It covered the immediate shortfall but left less margin than she wanted going into summer. There was also a man named Aldridge. He owned the property to the west, 400 acres of decent grazing land that he'd been running at low capacity for 3 years since his wife died, and his sons moved east. He was not hostile. He was something more complicated than hostile, which was indifferent in a way that occasionally curdled into obstruction. He'd let a section of his fence go down on the shared boundary, which meant the Ashford cattle occasionally drifted, which meant Dorian spent time he didn't have retrieving animals that shouldn't have needed retrieving. Dorian fixed the boundary fence himself the first time without saying anything to Aldridge. The second time he fixed it, he left a note. The third time, the note had not produced results. He rode over to Aldridge's property on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on the door. Clara heard about this from Dorian that evening. "How did he take it?" she asked. "About how you'd expect. He said the fence wasn't his responsibility on that line." "He's wrong about that. I told him so." Dorian was eating without looking up, which usually meant he was still working something over. "He's not a bad man. He's got nobody out there. 3 years, just him and 2 hired hands who don't stay." Clara looked at him. "That sounds like you're making excuses for him." "I'm not making excuses. I'm trying to understand the problem so I can figure out what to do about it." He pushed some food around his plate. "He's got cattle he's not managing well, and land he's not using. We've got more cattle than we had and not enough pasture through late summer when the south field goes dry." Clara set down her fork. "A grazing arrangement," she said. Shared fence maintenance, we use his west acreage July through September. He gets... Dorian stopped and looked up. He mentioned the calves. He said something about wanting to rebuild his herd, but not having the capital. 2 calves. One this fall, one next spring. Plus, we maintain the boundary fence for 2 years. Clara thought about this. It was the Matson logic applied sideways, that finding the thing the other party actually needed and trading something you could afford for something you couldn't do without. You worked this out before you came home. I worked it out on the ride back. And Aldridge? He's thinking about it, but he wants to hear it from you. She raised an eyebrow. From me? He's old-fashioned about contracts. He wants to talk to the person whose name is on the deed. Dorian said it without judgment, just fact. I told him you'd come Thursday. You told him. Was I wrong? She picked her fork back up. No, you weren't wrong. Thursday, she drove the wagon to Aldridge's property alone, which Dorian objected to mildly, and she ignored because the baby was in the house with Nora and she had a negotiation to conduct and she didn't need a second person present to conduct it. Aldridge was on his porch when she arrived, and he watched her climb down from the wagon with the expression of a man revising his expectations, which she'd seen often enough to be comfortable with. They talked for an hour. He was not an easy man to talk to. He had the habit of long pauses and the tendency of someone who'd lived alone too long to lose the thread of conversation and pick it back up from a different angle. But his instincts about land and cattle were sound, and when he made a point she disagreed with, she said so directly, and he seemed to find this more engaging than he'd expected. They came to terms. 1 calf in September, 1 in April, the boundary fence to be maintained by Ashford hands for 2 years, grazing rights on the west acreage July through September. She put it in writing on the kitchen table before she left, and Aldridge signed it in the careful, large script of a man who hadn't signed many contracts but understood their weight. Driving home, she thought about Owen and his verbal agreements, and she thought about Dorian's first law of transactions. Write it down. July arrived and Dorian turned 18 without ceremony, because he was not a person who made ceremony out of things that happened to him, only out of things he chose. Clara made a pie from the dried apples she'd been saving, and Nora decorated the table with wildflowers she'd picked along the fence line. And Dorian sat down to supper and looked at the pie and the flowers, and the 3 of them, the baby in his basket nearby producing small, indignant sounds about something. And he didn't say anything for a moment. "Happy birthday," Nora said, with the directness she'd developed over the past 8 months, the gap-toothed certainty of a child who had decided she was allowed to want things. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out slightly wrong, and he fixed it quickly and picked up his fork. Clara watched him eat 3 pieces of pie, which was not something she'd seen him do with anything, and decided that was enough of an answer. It was at the table after supper with the lamp lit and the baby finally asleep and the windows showing the deep blue of a July evening that Dorian said, "I need to talk to you about something." Clara put down her cup. Nora looked up from her almanac, the new one, the 1891 edition, a birthday present from Clara that had provoked actual visible surprise when she'd opened it, the second time Clara had ever seen her surprised. "I got an offer," Dorian said, "from Keene, the cattle drive north to the Sandover market." Clara knew Keene. He ran seasonal cattle drives, reliable man, paid fairly. "When?" "Leaves August 3rd, back by end of September." 8 weeks. She looked at him. He was looking at the table in the way he did when he'd already made a decision and was checking whether it was the right one. "How much?" she said. $60 for the drive, plus percentage if the herd sells above estimate. Could be 75, maybe 80. $75 was most of what they still owed Forsyth. It would change the August payment from a painful near miss to a genuine settlement with margin left over. "You want to go?" she said. "I think I should go." He looked up. "It's different from want." Nora was watching him. "You'll come back," she said. It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, old and complicated, the shadow of a man who had not come back, who would always be the reason Dorian understood both the weight of leaving and the weight of returning. "Yes," he said. Not "I'll try," or "if everything goes right," just yes, the plain, uncomplicated yes of someone who had thought about what promises cost, and had decided this one was worth the price. Nora looked at him for another moment, then looked back at her almanac. "Okay," she said, in a voice that was working to be casual and mostly succeeding. Clara looked at Dorian across the table. "We'll manage," she said. "We've managed before." "I know you will." He said it simply. "I'm not worried about that." "Then what are you worried about?" A pause. He looked at the baby's basket, at Nora's bent head, at the lamp, at his hands. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud first. Make it real." She understood that. Some things needed to be spoken before they could be trusted. "Then it's real," she said. "Go." He left on August 3rd with 2 saddlebags and the better of Owen's old horses, which she'd had him take without argument because a man on a cattle drive needed a reliable animal more than she needed to keep the count even. He rode out at first light, and Nora stood on the porch to watch him go, and Clara stood beside her with the baby on her shoulder, and Dorian turned at the end of the drive and lifted one hand, and they watched him until the road bent and the cottonwoods took him. "He'll be back," Nora said, to no one in particular. "He'll be back," Clara agreed. The 6 weeks without him were not as hard as the winter had been, but they were differently hard because by now the ranch had the shape of 3 people, and one person's absence left a gap that the work filled but that the evenings didn't. Nora was good company, and the baby was increasingly demanding company, and Clara found that being busy wasn't the same as not noticing. She handled what needed handling. She made the rounds Dorian would have made, checked the cattle, Dorian would have checked, fixed the 2 things that broke in August with varying success. The water pump required 3 attempts and a letter to Matson's hired man, who came over and fixed it properly for the price of dinner, which was a transaction she felt reasonably good about. The letter from Forsyth came in the 3rd week of August, which she'd been expecting. He was asking for confirmation of the August settlement date and the amount. She wrote back with the figures and the date. She didn't have Dorian's payment yet, but she knew what was coming in from the fall calves, and she knew what was in the coffee tin, and the math worked if the cattle drive paid what Keene had promised. She sent the letter to Forsyth on a Thursday. Dorian came back on a Saturday evening in mid-September, 3 days earlier than she'd expected, which turned out to be because the Sandover market had been good, better than estimated, and the drive had concluded early. He came up the drive in the same direction he'd left, on the same horse, looking lean from the weeks on the trail and slightly sun-darkened, and Nora heard the hoofbeats from inside the house and came to the door and stood there and didn't say anything. He came to a stop, looked at her, and got down from the horse. "Told you," he said. "I know," she said. And then she walked down the steps and crossed the yard and hugged him, which was not something she'd done before, and he stood very still for a moment like he was calculating whether this was real, and then he put one arm around her and held on. Clara watched from the porch with the baby on her hip and didn't say anything because some moments were better respected by silence. He came up the steps and reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope and handed it to her. She opened it. $83. She looked at him. "Heard sold above estimate," he said. Keene paid the percentage. She looked at the money, then at the baby, who looked back at her with the mild, alert expression he'd been developing lately, as if he were listening to things and forming opinions. Then at Dorian, who was standing on her porch in the September evening light, looking like someone who had gone somewhere and come back, which was not as simple as it sounded. "Come inside," she said. "There's supper." "Is there pie?" Nora asked from beside him. "No?" "There should be pie." "There's cornbread." "It's not the same." "Nora, I'm just saying." They went inside and the baby was installed in his basket, and Nora set the table with the efficiency of long practice, and Dorian sat in his chair. His chair, the one on the left near the window that had been his since December, and would have seemed strange for anyone else to sit in. And Clara put the food out, and they ate together in the particular way that people eat when they've been apart and come back together. And the coming back is itself the meal. After supper, after Nora went to bed, and the baby was asleep and the lamp was burning low, Clara put the $83 from the envelope and the amount from the coffee tin and the money from the fall calves in a single pile on the table. It was more than the Forsyth debt, not by much, but more. Dorian looked at the pile. "We can pay him," Clara said. "All of it?" "All of it, with a small amount left over." He was quiet for a moment. She'd noticed that he received good news with the same measured stillness that he received bad news. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd learned not to trust good news until it had been handled, counted, and confirmed. "We should do it in person," he said. "Ride to Millhaven. Hand it to him in person. So he can't dispute the date or the amount. So there's no paper trail he controls." He looked up. "And we get a receipt." Clara looked at him. 18 years old, sitting at her kitchen table, talking about evidence and receipts, and the importance of documentation in the way that some men his age talked about horses or cards or weather. "Monday," she said. "We ride to Millhaven Monday." He nodded. "I'll check the horses in the morning." She started to gather the money back into the envelope. Then she stopped. "Dorian." He looked up. She thought about the cedar box, about the letter that had been there since November, under the land survey, soft at the creases. She thought about the right time, which she'd been waiting for without knowing what it would feel like when it arrived. She thought it might feel like this, a September evening, a paid debt, a boy who had left and come back. "There's something I've been keeping," she said. "Something I found in November. I need to decide whether to show you, and I've been waiting because I didn't know the right time, and I think the right time might be now, but I want you to tell me if you'd rather not know." He went very still. "It's about where you came from," she said. "About your family, before the station." A long pause. The lamp shifted slightly, some movement in the wick and the light with it. "Owen," he said. Not a question. Not quite. She looked at him steadily. "He's the one who left us," Dorian said. "Isn't he?" She didn't answer immediately. There was no rush now. "Do you want to see the letter?" He was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table, the way they got when he was keeping himself still on purpose. "Not tonight," he said. "Okay. Maybe not. I don't know when." He looked at the table. "But I already knew. I think I knew from the first week. The way you went quiet sometimes. The way you looked at Nora." He paused. "I didn't say anything because it didn't change anything that mattered." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the September night was warm and dark and full of the sounds of a working ranch settling into itself. The cattle in the south pasture, the barn quiet, the cottonwoods along the drive moving in whatever breeze came off the ridge. "No," she said. "It doesn't." He nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the table, and they sat for a while longer in the kind of silence that has things in it. Not emptiness, but settled weight. The weight of a year's worth of deciding what to do with the difficult truths you inherit from people who are no longer there to answer for them. The money was in the envelope. The debt was almost finished. The baby was asleep in his basket. The ranch was not perfect. It had never been perfect and would not become perfect. There would be more fences, more bad winters, more men like Crow who wanted what others had built, more years of thin margins and hard math and problems that required the third option because the first two were both bad. But it was standing. All of it was standing, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. They rode to Millhaven on Monday, the way Clara had said they would. It was a clear morning, the kind that September produces occasionally on the northern frontier, like an apology for everything that came before. The sky a hard, clean blue, the air cool enough to be comfortable on horseback, the road dry for once all the way to the valley floor. Dorian rode Owen's horse, and Clara drove the wagon, and they didn't talk much on the way in because there wasn't much to say. The envelope was in Clara's coat pocket. The arithmetic had been done and redone. The conversation with Forsyth had been rehearsed in the way that necessary conversations get rehearsed. Not word for word, but in terms of what needed to be established and in what order. Forsyth was in his office above the hardware store, the same place he'd been the first time Clara had climbed those stairs with Dorian behind her and papers under her arm. He looked the same. He always probably looked the same. A man made of the same substance as the debts he held, unlikely to change based on other people's weather. He counted the money twice. Clara let him. When he finished the second count, he looked up with the expression of a man who had expected to be here, just not quite this soon. "Full settlement," Clara said, "with the interest through August as agreed." "I can see that." "I'll need the receipt now, dated today." He wrote it out without argument, which told her something she'd already suspected. That Forsyth, whatever else he was not a man who complicated a clean transaction. He had wanted money, not a ranch, not a fight. The money was here. The transaction was clean. He handed over the receipt and the canceled note, and Clara folded both carefully and put them in the envelope where the money had been, and she stood up. It was a difficult year, Forsyth said, with something that was not quite warmth, but was the closest approximation a man like him produced. Yes, Clara said. It was. She went down the stairs with Dorian, and they stood on the boardwalk outside the hardware store in the September morning, and she held the envelope against her chest for a moment with her eyes closed. Not dramatically, just for a second, just to feel what it felt like to hold a finished thing. Done, Dorian said. Done, she agreed. They were quiet for a moment on the boardwalk, people moving past them with the ordinary business of a Monday in Mill Haven, and then Dorian said, "Can we eat before we ride back? I haven't had a real meal in 6 weeks that wasn't trail food." Clara looked at him. "There's a diner on Clement Street." "I know. I was being polite." "You don't have to be polite about food." "I know that too." They ate at the diner on Clement Street, which was warm and smelled like coffee and bacon, and had a woman behind the counter who didn't look twice at the two of them, a pregnant widow and a tall 18-year-old who might have been her son or her nephew or her hired hand, depending on what story you needed to believe. Clara had eggs and coffee. Dorian ate a quantity of food that clarified just how thin the trail rations had been, steadily and without embarrassment, and when the woman refilled his coffee without being asked, he said thank you in the absent way of someone whose mind was somewhere else. "The fall market," he said. "I was thinking the same thing." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Matson's expecting his calves by end of October. We give him the 3 we promised, sell the rest. With the Aldridge arrangement, the herd's in better condition than anything we projected in January. I know the numbers. I know you know. I'm thinking out loud." He looked at the table. "We could hold 2 heifers back. For next year's breeding." I was going to suggest that. Instead of selling everything and being right back where we started in terms of herd size. Yes. She looked at him. He'd put on a little weight from the ride, which he'd needed. He'd been too lean through the summer, burning more than he was taking in, the way young men did when they were working too hard and sleeping too little. "You've been thinking about next year." "I've been thinking about 5 years from now." She raised an eyebrow. "The Aldridge arrangement runs 2 years. After that, either we renegotiate or we don't need it." He was looking at the cup, not at her. "If we hold the right animals back this fall and next, in 3 years we have a breeding program that doesn't depend on Matson's bull or Aldridge's pasture. We have our own." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about November, about a silver dollar on Mrs. Tully's desk, about 9 cattle and a broken fence and papers spread across the kitchen table that told a story of a man who had borrowed against everything and left a woman to sort it out. 5 years, she said. "Maybe 4, if the markets are decent." She drank her coffee. Outside the window, Millhaven went about its morning. A wagon, 2 men talking on the corner, a woman with a basket on her arm walking fast. Ordinary things. The ordinary things that are only visible when you have enough stability to look up from the immediate. "All right," she said, "let's talk about 5 years." They talked about it most of the way home, the wagon and the horse moving at an easy pace in the afternoon light, the conversation moving between the practical and the larger than practical in the way that planning conversations do when the people having them have stopped just trying to survive and started trying to build. It was the first time Clara had thought that way since before Owen died. Maybe since before Owen's problems had become fully visible. She had spent a year in the immediate, the next week, the next payment, the next problem, and somewhere between the diner on Clement Street and the road back to Ridgecross, she felt the future open up again into something longer than a season. It was not a comfortable feeling exactly. It was more like the feeling of using a muscle that had been still for a long time. A little unfamiliar, a little uncertain, but working. The fall cattle market in Ridgecross ran the last week of September, and the Ashford animals showed well. This was not an accident. Dorian had been managing the herd's condition through the summer with the Aldridge pasture giving them better grazing than they'd have had otherwise. And the calves from the Matson arrangement were notably heavier and better formed than anything the Ashford ranch had produced in the years before. Clara had heard this from Matson himself when she brought him his 3 calves, which he'd accepted with the particular grunt of a man who is satisfied but considers it undignified to say so. "These are good animals," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "They are." He looked at her. "Your boy knows cattle." "He does." He didn't say anything else about it, but he looked at the calves once more before walking them back to his pasture, which was compliment enough from a man like Matson. At the Ridge Cross market, Clara sold 7 animals, keeping the 2 heifers back, as agreed, for next year's breeding. The prices were the best she'd seen in her 3 years on the Ashford land. She didn't know if this was because the market was genuinely stronger or because the animals were genuinely better, and the honest answer was probably both. But she didn't examine it too closely because some things you accepted when they went your way without requiring a full accounting. She came home with more money than she had held at one time in any point in the past year, and she sat at the kitchen table with it and did the math that she'd been doing versions of since November. She paid herself, the amount she would have needed to pay a hired housekeeper for a year, which she put in a separate tin and told herself was not for the ranch, was for Clara Ashford, was for the woman who had not had anything that was only hers since before the wedding. It was a small number, but it was hers. She put the ranch expenses in a column and worked through them one by one. Feed, fence materials, the roof repair, the pump, Pratt's fee, which had been worth every cent, the percentage owed to Aldridge in the form of the spring calf already promised. And at the end, when all of it was subtracted, what remained was more than zero, meaningfully more than zero. She put the pencil down. Nora came in from the garden. October was coming and she was harvesting the last of the garlic, which had produced better than either of them had expected. The bulbs, fat and fragrant in a basket that Nora carried with the same understated satisfaction she brought to everything she'd grown from nothing. She set the basket on the table and looked at the numbers on the paper upside down, and then looked at Clara. "Good?" she asked. "Good," Clara said. Nora nodded and took the basket to the kitchen. Owen Dorian Ashford was 6 months old and had opinions about everything. He had his mother's stubbornness, and Nora had recently observed with scientific detachment the exact same look of focused irritation when something wasn't going his way that Dorian got when the fence wire didn't cooperate. Clara had told her not to say that to Dorian's face. Nora had said she would consider it. The baby was sitting up on his own now, or nearly. He got there and held it for several seconds before toppling sideways with an expression of profound injustice. He was not a quiet baby. He had a voice that carried through the house with no apparent effort, and an appetite that made Dorian's trail food hunger look restrained. He was the loudest thing on the Ashford ranch, which, given the ranch's other residents, was a meaningful distinction. He also had a habit of stopping crying immediately when Dorian picked him up, which Dorian had noticed and not commented on, but which Clara had noticed him noticing. "He just likes the height," Dorian said once, when Clara raised an eyebrow about it. "He can't see that high yet. He can feel it, the altitude." "That's not how babies work. I'm just saying." She let him have it. Some things didn't need to be pressed. October brought the first real rains and the particular quality of light that came in the fall afternoons, amber and low and making everything cast long shadows by 3 o'clock. The garden was put to bed. The root cellar was stocked better than it had ever been in Clara's memory of the place, and the 2 heifers she'd kept back were settled in the south pasture with the older cows, learning the routines of the place. It was in this October, with the year going golden and the worst finally behind them, that the town found its way back to the Ashford Ranch. Not in a formal way, not all at once. It came in the small increments that community comes and goes in frontier places. A woman from Ridgecross stopping on the road to admire the cattle count she could see from the fence line, and stopping long enough to say she'd heard the spring calving had gone well. A man from the feed store, Pemberton's son, coming by to discuss an ongoing credit arrangement now that the account was current, and staying long enough to drink a cup of coffee and ask about the fall numbers with the genuine interest of someone who had a stake in the valley's overall health. Matson came in late October, not on business, which was unusual for him. He came on a Sunday, which was his day for nothing that could be helped, and he sat on Clara's porch for 20 minutes and talked about the winter outlook and the condition of the valley's water table and whether the younger Aldridge boy was going to come back east and take over the property or leave his father to manage it alone. He didn't say anything about the Ashford Ranch specifically, but he'd looked at the fencing and the cattle and the general state of the place with the evaluating eye of a man who understood what things cost to maintain. And when he left, he said, "You've done well here," and meant it the way that people who don't waste words mean things. It was not redemption. Clara didn't need redemption from Ridgecross. She hadn't done anything that required it, but it was recognition, and recognition from people who had watched her buy 2 orphans with her last dollar and predicted disaster had a particular quality. Not vindication exactly, more like the settling of an account that she hadn't known she was keeping. She told Dorian about Matson's visit that evening. He was at the table with the account books, which he'd started doing in the evenings, not because Clara couldn't manage them, but because he'd asked to understand them and she'd said yes, and now it was a shared project the way most things on the ranch had become shared projects. He looked up when she told him. "What did he say exactly?" "You've done well here." Dorian looked at her for a moment. "He said you." "He was talking about the ranch." "He was talking about you." Clara shook her head, but didn't argue the point. The truth was that the line between herself and the ranch had blurred over the past year in ways she hadn't expected when she'd first come here as Owen's wife, with ideas about what her life would look like. The ranch was not separate from her. It was not a thing she managed. It was what she'd built, what she was still building, and the distinction between I and it had become largely academic. "He was talking about us," she said finally. "The ranch." Dorian accepted that and went back to the books. It was a week later, on a Friday evening, when the supper things were cleared and Nora was reading and the baby was improbably asleep at a reasonable hour, that Dorian looked up from the account books and said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something." Clara looked at him. "The legal arrangement," he said, "at the orphan station. It's guardianship." "Yes." "That ends at 18, for me." He said it carefully, the way he said things that mattered. "I aged out in July." "Technically." "So technically, I'm not—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not asking because I'm thinking of leaving. I'm asking because I want to understand what this is, what we are, legally, on paper." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwoods, the same sound it had made in November, in January, in April, when the blizzard came. The ranch made its night sounds, the cattle settling, the barn quiet, the world doing what it always did at the end of a day. "What do you want it to be?" she said. He looked at the table, at the account books, at the numbers in his own handwriting that were also her numbers, the ranch's numbers, all of it interwoven into something that didn't have a clean edge anymore. "I want it to be what it is," he said. "And what is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Home," he said. The word came out slightly rough, like it had been stored somewhere dry and airless for a long time and hadn't been used enough to stay smooth. "I just want to know if there's a way to put that on paper." Clara was quiet. She thought about Pratt, about the letters she could write to Millhaven, about the forms that existed for things like this in territorial law. She thought about a boy who had learned to negotiate before he'd learned to trust, who had memorized the difference between verbal agreements and written ones because the written ones were the ones that held. "There is a way," she said, "if you want it." He looked up. "It's called adoption," she said. "And Nora's already covered under the guardianship arrangement, which can be converted. But for you, at 18, it requires your consent as well as mine." She paused. "So, do you want it?" He looked at her with the same direct gaze he'd had on the bench in the orphan station. The one that wasn't hostility, just the readiness of someone who had learned to measure the distance between what people said and what they meant. Then he said, "Yes." Clara nodded once, the way he nodded once. "I'll write to Pratt next week." He went back to the account books. She went back to her mending. Nora turned a page of her almanac. The baby made a small sound from his basket that resolved into continued sleep. The letter to Pratt went out Monday. The legal process took the better part of 2 months, because legal processes always took the better part of 2 months. And there were forms and a court appearance in Millhaven in December that required all 3 of them to be present, and was conducted by a judge who asked several questions that Dorian answered with characteristic precision, and Nora answered with the terrifying composure of an 11-year-old who had decided she was not going to be nervous about a courtroom. The judge signed the papers on a Wednesday afternoon in December. Outside the courthouse in Millhaven, in a cold that was not as bad as last year's but was working on it, they stood on the steps in their good clothes and did not take a photograph because they didn't have a camera and no one was standing by with one. And that was fine. Some things don't need documentation. Some things you just carry. Dorian Ashford. On paper, now, the same as it had been in every way that mattered since April. He looked at the papers in his hands, the final, signed, courthouse stamped papers, with the expression he had when he was making sure a document said what it was supposed to say, running his eyes across the relevant lines. Then he folded them carefully and put them in his coat. Satisfied? Clara said. Yes, he said. It's in writing. Nora, who was standing on his left, said, Can we eat again? I'm cold. They ate at the same diner on Clement Street. It had become, without planning, the place they came to when something important happened in Millhaven. Dorian had the same quantity of food he'd had in September. Nora had pie because she had argued for it in the wagon on the way into town, and Clara had conceded the point, and she ate it with the satisfaction of someone who had been right about pie being appropriate to the occasion. Clara had coffee and watched them. Dorian with his papers folded in his coat and his face in its usual configuration of careful attention. Nora with her fork and her gap-toothed focus on the pie, and the particular quality of comfort she gave off when she was somewhere warm with food and people she trusted. Owen was with Aldridge's wife for the day, which was an arrangement that had developed over the fall into something neighborly and mutual without anyone formally agreeing to it, and Clara thought about him there, being held by someone else without distress, which 6 months ago would have seemed unlikely, and now seemed like exactly the kind of small evidence that the world had expanded past the size of one winter's emergency. She thought about the silver dollar. She thought about what it had looked like in her hand on the steps of the Harwick Orphans station. The weight of it, the complete absurdity of spending it the way she had. She had not been noble about it. She hadn't made the choice from some elevated place. She'd made it the way people make most of the choices that end up mattering, which is to say impulsively, based on something seen rather than something reasoned, and then committed to stubbornly because backing down would have required admitting the impulse was wrong. She'd seen Nora's almanac and Dorian's stillness, and the gap between what they were and what people usually bothered to notice about them, and she'd put the dollar on the desk. That was all. That was the whole heroic act. $1, one stubborn woman, one desk. What happened after wasn't a reward for the decision. There was no ledger keeping track of good choices and balancing them against difficulty. The blizzard came anyway. The debt came anyway. Crow came anyway. The roof still went soft. The pump still failed. Nothing was given back in exchange for doing the right thing. The right thing just produced its own results, over time, compounded by effort, which was a slower and less satisfying mechanism than reward, but was the actual one. What she'd gotten was not easier. She'd gotten these too, with all their specific difficulties and specific strengths. And in getting them, she'd gotten the fence repaired and the numbers done, and a baby delivered alive in a blizzard and a lawyer's letter that made Crow's false documents visible for what they were. She'd gotten Nora's garlic and Nora's almanac notes, and Nora's way of saying okay to hard truths and then going back to work. She'd gotten a boy who left on August 3rd and came back in September with $83 and a kept promise. That was the return on one silver dollar. Not comfort, not safety, not ease. Just this table, these people. This second December that was colder than the last, but carried none of the terror. What are you thinking about? Nora said. Clara looked at her. November, she said. Which part? The beginning. Nora considered this. It was cold. Yes. And we didn't know anything yet. No, we didn't. Nora put her fork down on the empty plate. I'm glad you came in, she said. Into the station. I'm glad you didn't keep walking. Clara looked at her across the table, at this 11-year-old who had memorized a farm almanac and marked frost dates and grown 12 heads of garlic from a frozen garden bed and sat on a courtroom floor with the composure of someone twice her age and who had, somewhere in the space of a year, become the person Clara could not imagine the house without. So am I, Clara said. Dorian had been listening with the particular quality of attention he had for conversations that mattered. Not joining, just present. He looked out the window at Clement Street, at the December cold outside the diner glass, and then back at his coffee. "We should get back before dark," he said. "I know. The road's going to freeze." "I know, Dorian. I'm just saying." "You're always just saying." He almost smiled. Not quite, but the almost was enough. They drove back in the cold afternoon, the wagon and the horse on the familiar road, the sky going the particular dark blue of a frontier December at 4 o'clock. Nora fell asleep in the wagon bed with her coat pulled up and her boots sticking out, 11 years old and entirely trusting the road to take her where it was going. Dorian drove, which he always did on the long stretches because it was easier for Clara, and he didn't need to discuss that anymore. And Clara sat beside him with her hands in her lap and watched the valley come back into view as they crested the last long ridge before the Ridgecross Road. The Ashford Ranch was visible from there on clear days, a small geometry of buildings and fence lines in the valley below, the south pasture where the cattle moved in the late afternoon, the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the cold, still air. It was not grand. It had never been grand. It was a working ranch with a bad year behind it, and more years ahead that would require as much from the people on it as the bad year had, because that was what land required, without sentiment or exception. But it was standing. In the December light, in the clear cold after the papers had been signed and the names had been written and the debt had been paid, it was standing. Clara looked at it from the ridge and thought about all the things she'd believed when she first came here, about what a ranch was, what a family was, what it meant to belong to a place or a person, all the simple geometries of a life she'd expected to live. Most of it had turned out to be wrong, or at least not the whole picture. The ranch had not been what she'd thought. Owen had not been what she'd thought. And she had not been what she'd thought either. Not the woman who could manage quietly and grieve quietly and keep everything in its place without letting any of it spill over into the sharp, difficult business of actually being alive. The hard year had been harder than anything she'd expected. It had also produced things she couldn't have planned for. A girl who grew garlic in frozen ground. A boy who showed up every morning without being asked. A baby who had arrived in a blizzard and announced himself to the world with a sound that broke open terror and replaced it with something else. She hadn't built this on her own. That was the thing she'd come to understand slowly, without wanting to admit it, because she was a woman who had spent a long time believing that needing was a form of weakness. She'd built it with two people who had needed her first, who had arrived with nothing and given everything they had, which turned out to be more than anyone looking at them from the outside would have guessed. That was what she hadn't known in November when she'd stood on the steps of the orphan station and looked at $1 in her hand. She hadn't known that the people the world discards are sometimes exactly the people a broken thing needs. She hadn't known that family was less about inheritance and more about the specific daily choice to stay. To fix the fence, to bank the fire, to sit at the table after supper and talk about 5 years from now. She hadn't known that belonging was something you built, not something you found. That it required the same things a fence required: regular attention, honest materials, the willingness to start over on the sections that failed without giving up on the whole. She still didn't know how the next 5 years would go. The winters would come. The margins would be thin in some years and better in others. There would be more problems she hadn't anticipated, more men like Crow, more debts that required the third option, more nights when the only thing between the ranch and disaster was two people with their hands on the same problem, refusing to let go. She knew that now. She'd earned that knowledge. "You're staring," Dorian said. "I'm looking. At the ranch." At the ranch. He looked at it too from the ridge for a moment. She could see him taking it in the way he took things in, steadily, completely, making it part of his understanding of the world. "It looks good from here," he said. "It does. Different than in November. Very different." He clicked to the horse, and they started down the ridge road, the wagon moving easy in the cold, Nora still asleep in the back, the smoke from the chimney going straight up ahead of them in the still December air. There was a baby at Aldridge's wife's house who would need picking up before supper. There was feed to check in the barn, and a heifer who'd been off her water for 2 days and needed watching. There were the account books on the kitchen table and the spring planning that hadn't started yet, and a letter to write to Pratt about a matter of boundary documentation that had come up with a new landowner 3 miles east. There was supper to make and a fire to bank, and another morning after that, and another after that, the ordinary accumulation of days that was not a story anyone would tell from the outside, but was, from the inside, Everything. Clara Ashford rode down from the ridge toward her ranch in December with a daughter who had grown garlic